Morning.
Good morning. Okay, why don't we get started? Um, can everyone see my screen? With the Aruch we're going to learn the Aruch HaShulchan today, just to finish up the Sif. The issue of a two-income family, or when the wife is the main bread earner of the family, is very, very complicated. And as I was snooping around, I noticed various shuvot, various responsa, which are extremely lengthy in trying to pick apart how you manage the husband's rights in those assets. But what becomes clear, we saw the opinion of the Bach yesterday, who says that when a woman is earning her own income, the husband does not have a right to demand that she surrender those assets or her work product or her mitzias, which is really what we're dealing with over here, anything she acquires from Hefker, but also anything that she brings into the home above and beyond what is necessary for the maintenance of the home. In other words, it seems like there's a certain modicum that the husband is allowed to say that I have control over when it comes to just covering the household expenses. But once, or whatever the standard of what the society says that a husband is allowed to ask of his wife to do to take care of the house. In other words, if the husband is working and he's providing for the basic essential needs of the household, then it seems like he's allowed to ask of his wife to take care of household chores, or in the absence of her taking care of those household chores, he has a right to ask her to contribute towards the payment for those household chores from her income. In other words, she has a right to say, I'm not going to, you don't have to sustain me, you don't have to feed me. I'm working, I'm making plenty of income on my own. I can cover the costs of my own needs, of my own wardrobe, of et cetera, et cetera. But even in that scenario, she still has an obligation to contribute to the basic needs of the household that society would, a Jewish community or a Beis Din would deem appropriate for a wife to contribute towards the maintenance of the home. But beyond that, a woman is allowed to keep her income on her own, just like a husband has a right. If he's making a lot of money and has a lot of disposable income, he's only obligated to contribute to the household, to the needs of the household, the children, and the maintenance of the house, the basic needs, and is not obligated to completely exhaust his income to go above and beyond that. So these are the sort of like the financial obligations of husbands and wives when there are two incomes. And as we've advanced into the 21st century, there seems to be a greater sense of parity and equality in the control of the household income. And so that's the reason for the ambiguity in the evolution of the halacha. And in most situations where there's a happy and a loving marriage, every couple works out on their own how they're going to manage this double income home. It becomes more complicated when the husband, let's say, doesn't want to work or is not capable of working or wants to stay in learning, and the wife becomes either the sole or the primary bread earner. And there too, the halacha seems to say that she's not obligated to surrender, at least according to the Bach, she's not obligated to surrender her entire income to under the husband's control. But for the sake of darchei shalom, for the sake of peace, the husband does have the say as far as whatever income is used for maintenance of the home. The husband has a right to decide how that income is going to be spent. But any additional income that the wife makes, she has control over. She gets to decide how she's going to use that money. And again, Compromise is king when it comes to maintaining shalom bayis, when it comes to maintaining the peace in the home. We touched on the laws of tzedakah yesterday, and this is the second time we're looking at this, but I don't believe we saw the Aruch HaShulchan the first time around when he talked about. You see, the Shulchan Aruch says that you're only allowed to accept a person collecting tzedakah is only allowed to collect small amounts from the woman of the household, out of a concern that she doesn't have the authority to contribute large amounts to tzedakah from her husband's assets. And therefore, there may be a question of gezela, there may be a question of stealing if you accept a large check from a woman, because who knows whether she's gotten the authorization from her husband who controls those assets. And the Aruch HaShulchan, who lives at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, is prepared to say that we are allowed to be lenient in this area. And I just wanted to look at that text with you for just a moment, and that'll be how we round out this seif and halacha. He writes as follows: Gabay tzedakah ein mekablen mehanoshim ba'avodim u'meitinokos ela davar muat. So the community tzedakah collector is known as the Gabay tzedakah. And, it could be any organization. It could be Tomchei Shabbos. It could be Bikur Cholim. They're not allowed to accept large gifts from women and children. They're only allowed to accept small token gifts. Avalo davar gadol shechezkaso gazul oganov mishal acher. But to accept large gifts, we have to be concerned that perhaps it may be stolen, in the sense that they do not receive proper authorization. And to determine what is considered a small gift or a sizable gift all depends upon the income of the person in question. It could be that if the person is truly mega wealthy, then $1,000 gift is considered to be a small gift, whereas maybe $10,000 is considered to be a large gift. But if it's a middle class person, maybe $100 is a small gift and $1,000 is a large gift. It all would depend. That would have to be eyeballed by the person who's in charge of collecting the tzedakah. Now, but he says, with that said, v'hani mili bistama, aval im haba'al mocha afilu kol shehu asu l'kabel mehem. But that's only if we have no reason to suspect that there's any acrimony in the household, or if the husband goes along with the wife. But if we know that the husband has made it clear that I don't want my wife giving tzedakah, she throws away money, and we can't afford to give the types of checks that she writes to tzedakah, so then no tzedakah collector is permitted, according to halacha, to accept her check. Because if we know that the husband is unhappy with it, then it truly is geneva. It's truly stealing. Okay, and then he continues and he says, if Beis Din were to impose any kind of penalty, financial penalty on a woman for whatever reason, the husband becomes liable for that payment. In other words, the fact that a husband has control over the household assets also makes him liable to pay for the expenses that the wife incurs. Also, if let's say she made a pledge before she got married, then once they're married, the husband has to pay for that pledge. And then finally, the Ba'er Hetev writes another interesting halacha. He says that if a man marries a woman who comes from a poor family, and he, thank God, is blessed with wealth, and she says to her husband, my brother, my parents, they need to be supported. You need to support them, and she gives them money from the joint bank account. There, the husband cannot protest, because this is family and he's obligated to support the family. And the Aruch HaShulchan writes, Bahadavar tamua de'ech b'yacholta litein ba'al korcha, and ba'al korcho. He says, I don't understand why that should be. If we just got through saying that the wife cannot give away the husband's money without his consent, And let's say the husband says, I don't want to support your brother. He's, he's a ne'er-do-well. He's a bum. He doesn't get a job and he's just waiting for me to support him. Why should I be obligated to? Why can she unilaterally decide? So this is the Aruch HaShulchan's question on the Be'er Heted that he's just quoted, is how can it be that in light of everything that we've just learned about, if when a husband protests, the wife has no rights to give away his money to tzedakah, but when it comes to family, she does have that right. That's the question. And he says, but if you wait till we get to Sif Yud Gimel, perhaps we'll be able to answer this question. So we're doing Sif Yud Aleph. Let's go to Sif Yud Beis, and then we'll get to Sif Yud Gimel. So in Sif Yud Beis, he writes, Choshen Mishpat Siman Pei Aleph Nisba'er, Demisha Hitna im Echad Lilmodim Ben Chavero Torah B'fnei Ha'av. We know that there's a halacha as follows. Let's say a third party negotiates with a tutor to pay a certain amount, that the father will pay a certain amount to this tutor for learning with his son, for tutoring his son. If this negotiation was held in the father's presence and he was silent, and they negotiate, okay, we're going to pay you, let's say, $40 an hour for you to tutor this boy, and the father is silent, so then the father has an obligation to pay. This is a real life scenario that happens. Let's say the principal of the school calls you up one day and he says, in order for your son to be able to maintain his grades, he's falling behind, he's going to need a tutor. Please come to the school where we can have you meet a potential tutor. And then the father comes, he meets a potential tutor, and the principal says, so-and-so, we're going to be paying you, Mr. Bernstein will be paying you $40 an hour to tutor his son. Is everything agreed? And the tutor says yes. If the father is silent, that's tacit approval, and he's contractually obligated to pay. So that's the halacha in the laws of tzedakah. But if the negotiations were made behind the father's back, even though he may have heard later that was the negotiation, he's not obligated to pay the tutor because it was not done with his consent. V'zehu ba'acher, aval bi'ishto shel adam, shehiskira melamed livna, afilu shelo befana v'yada mizeh v'shosak v'aday nichalei v'chayev l'shalom. But all that we've set up until now is with a third party. But if the man's wife negotiates with the tutor and agrees to pay him a certain amount, even if the husband is not present, we assume that he's okay with it and he's obligated to pay. But that's only if he's silent, okay? But if he immediately protests and says, you agreed to pay what? How much did you pay per hour? I can't afford that. Then he can nullify it, but only upon immediately hearing it if he immediately protests. And there's a word missing here. But if he did not immediately protest and he just listened and was silent, so then his silence is tacit approval, and even though afterwards he wants to renege on that agreement, he doesn't have a right to do so. I mean, he can dismiss the tutor after a certain amount of time, but whatever was negotiated contractually between the mother and the tutor has to be honored by the father. And furthermore, even when she is when she has control over the household assets, the husband can always protest how the wife spends the money, because in a marriage, the joint bank account, the husband has ultimate control over that joint bank account, and therefore, if he's unhappy with the way that she's spending the family money, he has the right to protest. But then he writes as follows: V'dad yesh misha sover the isha kishehi asuka b'mischar lo amrinan bazeh mashakansi isha kanabayla. But you should know, and here he's quoting the Mishnah Lamelech, he's quoting the Maharit, and these poskim say that when a woman herself is involved in working and gaining in her own income, we do not say that whatever she brings into the family is under the sole proprietorship of the husband. And therefore, in such a scenario where the woman is working just like the husband, then you can accept large checks from the woman because she has control over her assets beyond a certain amount, a minimal amount, which she has to contribute to the family account. And even though it's not 100% clear that we paskin that way, that we paskin that whenever a woman is earning her own income, that she is allowed to spend that money as she sees fit. It's, there's some who say yes, some who say no, but the Aruch HaShulchan says at the end of the day, certainly when it comes to the laws of tzedakah, you can rely on this halacha because there you can also assume there's a lot of other assumptions that a tzedakah collector is allowed to make. He's allowed to also assume that the wife is not doing anything that is contrary to the husband's wishes. And also, like the Imrei Yaakov explains, that in the old days, they used to be able to forcibly levy every household for tzedakah. And since nowadays we don't do that, we can assume that this is sort of like a surrogate for the mandatory levy that used to exist. And he brings another opinion. He says, the Biyam Shel Shlomo from the 18th century, he writes, he says, today you are allowed to accept large amounts from a woman, from the matron of the household. Because today women are considered to be custodians over the house, over their husband's income. In other words, there's a greater level, and what we're seeing is that there's an evolution of women's financial rights that was already taking place during the Renaissance period. That women were basically elevated their status, that whereas in the Middle Ages, women had no control at all over whatever the husband was earning. Later, in later centuries, even though the husband still maintained control, but you're allowed to accept large gifts according to the Yam Shel Shlomo, because women's status has been elevated, that at least they have a say, and the husband trusts their opinion as far as how the money is going to be spent. Od kasav sham bedin shehiskira melamed livna, afal pishalo yadanu beirur sheyada, amrinan nistama yada ad sheyavi raya shelo yada ein sham. And the Yam Shel Shlomo also writes that it's for that reason that when she hires a tutor, we are allowed to assume that the husband has consented until he brings actual evidence that he never consented. If he doesn't bring evidence and just makes a claim, that's not sufficient for him to shirk his responsibility to pay the tutor that the wife had already negotiated for. And then finally, in Sif Yud Gimel, he writes as follows: "V'yira'eh la'anios daiti." And it would seem to me, in my opinion, says the Aruch HaShulchan, "B'keven d'kaimel and d'kofen al tzedakah, ve'achshav b'zman hazeh yadua she'en lo koach lachuf." This actually, what I just mentioned before from the Imrei Yaakov, is what the Aruch HaShulchan himself says. He says, it seems to me that it used to be in the good old days, if you were part of a Jewish community, we could coerce the community members to give forth a certain minimal amount of tzedakah per family, that we could levy a tax on each member of the community to give whatever we deem for that person to be appropriate. And today we've lost that power. Community leadership does not have that same financial hold over its members, and therefore, since we don't have that ability, and therefore, if there is, let's say, a wealthy Jew in the community, and he's miserly. Okay, he's a miserly guy. He doesn't give what he ought to give based on his tzedakah, but we know that his wife is much more soft-hearted than he is. Certainly, it's if we know that the husband does not want to give tzedakah, and the wife does, she doesn't have the unilateral right to just give out money from the account if she knows that the husband objects. But with one caveat. Omnam im harab shabir omerla shalafi erko im haya yadenu tekifa hayinu kofen oso litin kach bekach yichola litin kashir hazeh. He says, but based on what we said above, that in the good old days we used to be able to levy wealthy people certain amounts to support the community, if she speaks to the Rav of the city or the Rav of the community, and the Rav tells her, if we were living, let's say, in the 16th century, a man of your husband's income would have been levied a tax of this number of dollars based on his income to help support the community, then based on that, she's allowed to write a check for that amount, even without her husband's consent. And if that's going to, if the husband protests afterwards, he has no legal recriminations after the fact. V'lama nigara b'meh she'en b'yacholtenu lachufo, im yesh b'yacholtenu lahotzi hatzdaka shu mechuyev midina. He says, and it's basically based on the fact that, yes, it's true that today community leaders do not have the same financial strengths that they had in previous generations, but at least to allow us to accept tzedakah from the wife, that we do have. Afalgav tekefiyahu midas habalim v'kanu shalom midaito. Mikol makom kevin shu mechuyev b'sach zeh ela she'en b'yachol let lachufo. Mikol makom achiyuv mutal alav v'anachnu danim bazeh kefi chiyuvo. He says, and that's the argument. He says, normally in the good old days, we could even coerce a person to surrender a certain amount of tzedakah. Today, we don't have that ability, but at least based on what we used to have the ability to do, we can certainly accept a check from a wife, provided that the assessment is that the family can afford it, and that would be normally what would be expected. And it happens quite often that you have situations like that, where the husband may be of significant means, but for whatever reason he's insecure with his finances and doesn't want to surrender a certain amount to the community chest, or to the shul, to the school, whatever community needs are required. And in that situation, we would accept a large check from the wife if it's commensurate to that husband's ability to give, and the family can afford it. And v'ra'iti legadol echad she'aser b'chahai gavna v'ulai b'yamav haya adayin koach b'yad beis lachufa ma'shenkin b'zmanenu zeh. Even though he says, I note that the Noda B'Yehuda of the 18th century did not allow this, but it could be that was because back then the community leaders could still assess a levy, and therefore we shouldn't rely on this heter, because we can assess people using the normal channels, and therefore we shouldn't accept gifts from the wife. Ulefizeh, but based on what I've just written, Atei Shapir Mashi Shinu B'Sof Sif Yud Aleph Le'inin Kroveha She'enu Yachol Limchos B'Yada Ve'ech B'Yacholtenu Litein Bal Karcha B'Liv Barenu Asei Shapir the B'Davar Shu Mechuyev B'Yacholto Lasos V'Hadavar Pashish Kolishin Mitzvah B'Ala Nasan LaRishus T'Emet. Okay, but going back to our question at the end of Sif Yud Aleph, we had asked the question: how can a woman go behind her husband's back and support her, let's say, her poor brother, if we know that the husband has not consented to that, but just because he's a relative? And so the answer is that if in that scenario the community leaders would actually require the husband to do that, if they had the ability to do so, then she's coming with the authority of the community leadership. So when the Be'er Heitev had said that we can coerce the husband against his will if the wife so wishes to give her relatives tzedakah, that's only once it's done in consultation with the community leaders who are aware of the situation and are able to make an objective evaluation of the situation and to determine that, yes, indeed, these people qualify as aniyim, and yes, indeed, the husband qualifies as someone who's capable of supporting them. And we know that when it comes to the laws of tzedakah, a person has to support family first before supporting other causes. And therefore, the wife is working not only under her sole authority of writing those checks, but under the authority and the sanction of the community leadership as well. And that's on that basis, the Aruch HaShulchan says that there are many instances where you are allowed to accept large contributions from the wife of the home, even if she's not the main breadwinner of the household. So number one, if she's earning her own income, you can certainly accept large gifts from her. Number two, even if she's not working, but her husband is the main bread earner, you can still accept major gifts in a situation where the community leaders make the assessment that this is an acceptable amount, this is a reasonable amount based upon what the husband's income would normally require him to give to that community effort. Okay, questions, comments?
Rabbi, I have a quick question from a real life situation that happened to my wife and myself last night when we went out for a walk. Going back to the laws of Hefker, so we're walking along, and what happened is we saw, for example, that on our driveway, they drop off this local newspaper called the Liberal, and it had there's different ads in there and coupons or whatever. So, anyways, we noticed we didn't have one. Now, the fact that that was put on every driveway, not on ours, is there any issue with us taking from another driveway? Because this is not something that the household owned. This is something that was put on their driveway and put on other driveways.
It's a good question. First of all, you can always come to my house because I throw mine away right away. So if you ever find that you don't have one, you can come to my driveway and you'll be doing me a favor. But as far as we did say that if something is deposited on a person's property and they are aware of it, then they can make a mental statement that I want my property to acquire that object, assuming that it's not going to walk off the property on its own, of its own volition. And when you have an inanimate object that is deposited on my property, if it's clear, if there's even a possibility that the owner may have said, I want that newspaper, then no, you do not have a right to pick it up and take it for yourself. So you do not have a right to take the newspaper from someone else because maybe they want that newspaper. You have no evidence that they don't want it, right? So it would be a problem. I mean, if you found it on the curb of the street and it's not on private property, or it's on the sidewalk, which is also not private property, so then you might be able to make the argument, well, the owner hasn't claimed it, and so why don't I just take it? But from a menschlichkeit point of view, it might be a good idea just to ask the person whose house it's in front of, do you mind if I take your newspaper? I notice that you haven't picked it up yet. That would probably be the right thing to do. All right. So that's it. So that's it for today. Yes, anyone else?
I was just going to ask you, Rabbi, if young couples today, if you would advise them to combine their money and their assets, you mentioned joint accounts and such.
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's very hard for me to answer about young couples today because there's a lot that I don't understand about young couples. I'll be honest with you. There's a lot about millennials that I don't understand because some of their behaviors are very foreign to me. There are, a lot of times couples get married to figure out if they are compatible, and they go on a trial run. And to me, that doesn't make any sense. But if there's a certain uncertainty whether the marriage is going to survive the initial period, then maybe it does make sense. But when my wife and I got married, we didn't have two nickels to rub together, so it didn't make any difference, because 0 plus 0 is still 0, or 1 plus 1 is 2. It wasn't enough. So we had to pool our assets together in order to make life work for the two of us. And there's a certain advantage to having that kind of limited income, because it obligates you to figure out how you're going to survive together. And that's, I think, part of the problem. One of the fallouts of living in a luxurious economy like we do, we're blessed with disposable income today that we didn't have it when we were younger, perhaps. And that is that everyone feels a sense of autonomy and that really does damage the institution of marriage. So I think it's a personal decision that couples have to make on their own. Okay. So have a great day, everyone, and good Erev Shabbos. We'll see you, Mirz Hashem, on Monday. Take care.